The photograph arrives in a manila envelope with no return address, and when your fingers brush the edges of the albumin print, something cold travels up your arm. Not the chill of old paper but something deeper, something that knows your name. The image shows a young woman seated in a parlor chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her lips curved into the faintest smile. The date inscribed in sepia ink along the bottom reads, April 1888. Before we go further into what this smile conceals, make sure you're subscribed, because what you're about to discover about Victorian death photography will change how you look at every antique portrait you encounter. Hit that subscribe button now because this investigation requires witnesses, and you'll want to share what we uncover together. The smile is wrong. Not obviously so, not the grotesque leer of a carnival mask or the frozen rictus of a corpse, but wrong in the way a familiar word becomes strange when repeated too many times, wrong in the way your reflection sometimes seems to move a fraction of a second after you do. The woman in the photograph is beautiful. Pale skin, dark hair parted severely down the middle and pulled back in the fashion of the late Victorian era, a high-collared black dress that gleams with an oily sheen even through the grain of the old print. But that smile. It sits on her face like something placed there, like a mask that doesn't quite fit the contours beneath. You hold the photograph closer to the lamp on your desk. The light catches the surface of the print, and for a moment you see it, the way the smile doesn't reach her eyes. In fact, her eyes don't seem to be looking at anything at all. They're open, yes, wide open, but there's a quality to them that makes your stomach turn over slowly, the way it might if you suddenly realized you were standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. The pupils are enormous, two black pools that seem to have swallowed the iris almost entirely, and they're fixed on a point somewhere past the camera, past the photographer, past the walls of whatever studio this portrait was taken in. Fixed on something you cannot see and suddenly do not want to. This is your first clue, though you don't know it yet. The eyes. Always start with the eyes. In the parlors and photographic studios of Victorian England and America, death wore many faces, but it most often wore the face of sleep. The custom of post-mortem photography flourished in the decades following the daguerreotype's invention in 1839, offering grieving families a final portrait of their departed loved ones, often the only photograph that would ever exist of them. The dead were posed as if merely resting, children cradled in their mother's arms, young men propped in chairs, infants arranged on pillows with flowers scattered around them like offerings. The long exposure times required by early photographic processes, sometimes several minutes even in good light, made the deceased ideal subjects. They would never move, never blur the image with the involuntary twitch of a muscle or the nervous fidget of a hand. The living had to remain still as statues to avoid appearing as ghosts in their own portraits, but the dead had already achieved that perfect, terrible stillness. But there were other photographs, rarer ones, that showed something different. Photographs where the dead were posed not as sleeping but as alive. Eyes propped open with small wires or glass prosthetics. Bodies held upright by iron stands hidden beneath clothing or behind furniture. Smiles. Yes, smiles, created by careful positioning of the jaw, sometimes by thin wires threaded through the flesh of the cheeks to pull the corners of the mouth upward. These were the photographs that families commissioned when they could not bear to see their loved ones at rest, when they needed one last image of the person they had known, animated and present, even if that animation was an elaborate fiction constructed in the chemical stinking darkness of a photographer's studio. The woman in your photograph is smiling. You set the print down on your desk and step back from it, but your eyes keep returning to her face, drawn by a compulsion you don't fully understand. There's something about the quality of the light in the image, the way it seems to pool in the hollows of her cheeks and throat, that makes you think of water collecting in the bottom of a well. The background is indistinct, softened by the shallow depth of field common to collodion wet plate photography, but you can make out the shapes of furniture. A small table with a vase of flowers, a curtain pulled back to reveal a window through which pale light streams in a single shaft, heavy with suspended dust motes rendered visible by the long exposure. Your second clue waits in the tension of her jaw, in the particular arrangement of her mouth. Look closer. Closer still. Ignore the way your heart has begun to beat faster. Ignore the irrational conviction that if you look away from the photograph even for a moment, something in it will change. Focus on the smile. On the lips, slightly parted to reveal a sliver of teeth. On the way the corners of the mouth turn upward in a curve that seems almost geometric in its precision, as if drawn by a compass rather than formed by the complex interplay of muscles and tissue that creates a human expression. A real smile involves the entire lower face. The zygomatic major muscle pulls the corners of the mouth up and out, the levator labii superioris lifts the upper lip, the orbicularis oculi contracts around the eyes, creating the crow's feet that mark genuine joy. This is why false smiles are so easy to detect in life. The mouth may lie, but the eyes, the cheeks, the dozens of minute muscular contractions that accompany real emotion, cannot be consciously controlled. The woman in the photograph is smiling with her mouth alone. The rest of her face is perfectly, impossibly still. In the 1880s, photographers had developed techniques for posing difficult subjects. Drunks, the mentally ill, the recently deceased. The mortuary studios that specialized in postmortem portraiture kept detailed journals of their methods, grim notebooks filled with sketches and notations about exposure times, chemical baths, posing techniques. Some of these journals survive in museum collections, and they make for disturbing reading. There are diagrams showing how to use a posing stand, a heavy iron device with an adjustable clamp, to hold a body upright. Instructions for using thin wire to keep eyes open, or to pull the mouth into a smile. Notes on cosmetics. Powders to conceal the gray pallor of death, rouge to bring color to cheeks that would never flush with blood again. One journal, kept by a photographer in Philadelphia whose studio operated from 1875 to 1891, contains a passage that has stayed with you since you first read it in a book about Victorian mourning practices. The smile is the most difficult expression to achieve in the recently departed. The muscles of the face settle into a neutral expression within hours of death, and rigor mortis locks them there. To create the appearance of joy requires physical intervention. Small wires threaded through the cheeks, a thin wooden dowel placed between the teeth to hold the jaw at the correct angle. The effect is never perfect. There is always something wrong about it, something that the eye recognizes even if the mind cannot articulate what it sees. The dead can be made to smile, but they cannot be made to look happy. You pick up the photograph again, holding it at an angle to catch the light. There, do you see it? Just visible at the corners of the woman's mouth, two tiny shadows that might be nothing, might be artifacts of the printing process, but might also be the entry points of the wires that hold her smile in place. The shadows are symmetrical, perfectly matched, and they extend into the flesh of her cheeks like thin dark threads. Your hands are shaking now, just slightly. You set the photograph down again and step away from the desk, but the image follows you, burned into your retinas. When you close your eyes, you see her face floating in the darkness behind your eyelids. That terrible smile, those empty eyes. The third clue is written in her body, in the way she sits in the chair. Posture reveals everything. The human body, when alive and conscious, is never truly still. Even when we think we're sitting motionless, we're engaged in constant minute adjustments. Shifting weight from one side to another, readjusting the angle of the spine, moving the head fractionally to ease tension in the neck. The body is always in conversation with gravity, always balancing and rebalancing itself. This is why long exposure photography was so difficult in the early days of the medium. Subjects who tried to remain perfectly still would inevitably move, creating blurred images, ghost images, photographs where faces appeared as pale smears and hands dissolved into vapor. The woman in the photograph shows no signs of movement blur. Not the slightest smudge or doubling of edges. She might as well be carved from marble. Victorian photographers developed various devices to help their subjects remain still during long exposures. Head clamps that attached to the back of a chair and held the skull in a vice-like grip. Arm rests with hidden clamps to keep hands from trembling. Footrests anchored to the floor. And for the most difficult subjects, children, the infirm, the dead, there were the posing stands. Adjustable iron frameworks with clamps and braces that could hold a body in virtually any position. These stands were designed to be hidden in photographs, concealed behind the subject's clothing or positioned carefully in the shadows beyond the depth of field. But they left signs for those who knew to look for them. The woman's dress is black, but not the ordinary black of mourning cloth. It has a particular sheen to it, a heavy lustrous quality that speaks of crepe, that peculiar ribbed silk fabric that was the material of deep mourning in Victorian society. Crepe was expensive, uncomfortable, and required for widows in the first stages of grief. It couldn't be brushed or cleaned without destroying its characteristic texture, so it would gradually become shabby, the ribs flattening and the fabric taking on a dusty, tired appearance. The crepe in the photograph is fresh, the ribs sharp and defined, which tells you this dress is new. The woman is in the first stage of mourning, or rather she was when this photograph was taken. But mourning for whom? The dead cannot grieve. Look at the way she sits. The spine is perfectly vertical, perpendicular to the seat of the chair with an unnatural rigidity. Living people slump, even slightly, even when they're trying to maintain good posture. The spinal column is a flexible structure, designed to curve and bend. This woman sits as if something is holding her upright, holding her spine in a position no living body would maintain for the length of time required for a photographic exposure in 1888. Several seconds at least, possibly more if the light was poor. Now look at the shadows. The light in the photograph comes primarily from the window visible in the background, a single source creating strong directional shadows. The woman casts a shadow behind her as expected. But there's another shadow, fainter and more diffuse, extending from the center of her back down to the floor. It's positioned exactly where a posing stand would be, one of those iron frameworks with its vertical shaft rising behind the subject's spine, its base hidden beneath the voluminous skirts of her dress. The shadow is faint because the stand is behind her, partially blocked by her body, but it's there. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. She is being held up. Something is holding her in that chair, keeping her spine straight, her head at precisely the correct angle. Something metal and cold and hidden from view. The smell of collodion is in your nostrils now, though this is impossible. You are in your own home, in your own time, more than a century removed from the moment this photograph was taken. But you smell it anyway, that sharp, acrid smell of ether and alcohol, the chemical odor that filled photographic studios in the 1880s when the photographer prepared the glass plates, coating them with the viscous collodion solution and then sensitizing them in a bath of silver nitrate. The plates had to be used wet. Once the collodion dried, it lost its light sensitivity. So photographers worked in a rush, coating and loading and exposing and developing in a continuous sequence, their darkrooms reeking of chemicals, their fingers stained black with silver salts. Some photographers claimed they could taste the silver, a metallic tang on the back of the tongue, bitter and persistent. You taste it now. Silver on your tongue like old coins, like blood. Your fourth and final clue waits in the details surrounding her, in the careful arrangement of objects that frame her body. Mourning had its own language in the Victorian era, a complex vocabulary of symbols and objects that communicated the bereaved's relationship to the deceased, the stage of their grief, the social status of the dead. Jet jewelry, deep black ornaments carved from fossilized wood, was worn by those in mourning, often incorporating locks of the deceased's hair woven into intricate patterns or enclosed in glass lockets. Mourning brooches, mourning rings, mourning necklaces. An entire industry existed to supply the grieving with the appropriate symbols of their loss. The period of mourning was strictly codified, particularly for widows, who were expected to wear black for at least 2 years after their husband's death, progressing through stages of increasingly less restrictive mourning dress. First came deep mourning, heavy black crepe, no jewelry except jet, veils of black fabric that obscured the face. Then came half mourning, lighter fabrics, the introduction of gray and lavender, the gradual return to society. The woman in the photograph wears jet jewelry. You can see it at her throat, a brooch, oval-shaped, made of the characteristic deep black material. But it's what's inside the brooch that makes your breath catch in your throat. Hair. Human hair, woven into an elaborate knot, brown hair turned almost black in the photograph, visible through the glass front of the brooch. Memorial hair jewelry was common in Victorian mourning traditions. Brooches, rings, and lockets containing hair of the deceased were worn as tokens of remembrance, physical connections to the dead. The hair was believed to be incorruptible, to last long after the flesh had decayed, and so it became a symbol of eternal memory, eternal love. Whose hair does she wear at her throat? Her husband's? A child's? Or, and this thought arrives like a cold hand on the back of your neck, her own hair, removed post-mortem and fashioned into a memorial by someone who grieved for her? The table beside her holds a vase of flowers. You can see them in the photograph, slightly out of focus but identifiable. Roses, their petals dark even in the monochrome of the print. But there's something wrong with them. The petals are drooping, curled at the edges in the way that flowers do when they've begun to decay. These are not fresh flowers, not blooms cut that morning and placed in water. These are flowers that have been dying for days, perhaps for weeks, their stems dried and their petals turning brown at the edges. In the language of Victorian mourning, wilted flowers represented death, loss, the inevitable decay of all living things. Fresh flowers were for celebrations, dead flowers were for the grave. But why would a photographer include dead flowers in a portrait? Why not replace them with fresh blooms, or remove the vase entirely? Unless the flowers are meant to be there. Unless they are part of the message this photograph is intended to convey. You look at the woman's face again, at that smile, at those empty eyes. The light from your desk lamp seems to have grown dimmer, or perhaps your eyes are adjusting to some other quality of darkness, some darkness that emanates from the photograph itself. The image seems to have more depth than it should, as if you could reach through the surface of the print and touch the woman's cheek, Feel the coldness of her skin, the stiffness of the wires in her mouth. The parlor trick of Victorian death photography was this: to make the dead appear alive at least for the instant captured by the camera's lens. To deny death its victory, to steal back from the grave one last image of the departed as they had been in life. But sometimes the trick went the other way. Sometimes the camera captured not life in death, but death in life. The terrible stillness beneath the animated surface, the emptiness behind the glass eyes, the mechanical nature of the smile held in place by wire and wood, and the photographer's grim determination to give the family what they had paid for. The woman in the photograph is dead. You know this now with absolute certainty. She has been dead for days, perhaps weeks. Her body has been preserved, embalmed or kept on ice. The techniques for preserving corpses were improving throughout the 1880s, and brought to the photographer's studio, where she was dressed in fresh mourning crepe, positioned in a chair with the help of an iron posing stand, her eyes propped open, her mouth arranged into a smile, her hands folded in her lap with fingers interlaced just so. The photographer would have worked quickly, coating his plate with collodion, loading it into the camera, removing the lens cap to begin the exposure, counting off the seconds while the light poured through the lens and etched the image of this dead woman onto the silver-sensitized glass. 30 seconds. 40. A minute. However long it took to capture enough light to create a properly exposed negative. And through all of it she would have been perfectly still, perfectly posed, perfectly dead. But the photograph is more than just a post-mortem portrait. There's something else in it, something you're only beginning to see. An intentionality, a message encoded in the arrangement of objects and the quality of the light. Someone went to great effort to create this image, to pose this woman in precisely this way, to include these specific symbols and objects. The wilted flowers. The jet brooch with its cargo of hair. The black crepe dress. The smile. The smile that doesn't reach her eyes. The smile that says, I am here. I'm still here. I am waiting. A sound pulls your attention away from the photograph. A creak from somewhere in your house, the settling of old wood or the expansion of metal pipes, ordinary sounds that houses make at night. But your heart is hammering now, your hands cold and clammy, and when you look back at the photograph on your desk, you see something you didn't notice before. The vignetting around the edges of the print is darker than it should be, as if the light in the photograph is being consumed by something, drawn down into some darkness that exists not in the image but behind it, beyond it. And in that darkness, at the very edge of visibility, you can see shapes, figures. The suggestion of other faces, pale and indistinct, crowded around the woman in the chair. A crowd of mourners, perhaps, gathered to pay their respects. Or perhaps something else. Something that was in the room when the photograph was taken, something that stood just beyond the reach of the camera's lens, waiting in the shadows where the light could not reach. You want to put the photograph away, to slide it back into its envelope and forget about it, but you cannot look away. The woman's eyes seem to have shifted, though you know this is impossible. Know that the image is fixed, unchangeable, a moment frozen in silver and glass. But they seem to be looking at you now, those huge dark eyes, looking at you from across the gulf of more than a century, and in them you see not the blankness of death but something worse. Awareness. Knowledge. Recognition. She knows you're looking. She has always known. This photograph was meant to be found, meant to be examined, meant to be understood by someone with enough knowledge to read its secrets, to translate the language of Victorian death into meaning. The photographer who took this image left a message in it, encoded in shadows and symbols, in the particular quality of the woman's smile and the arrangement of objects around her. A message that says, this is what we did to the dead. This is how we denied death. This is how we sinned against nature and propriety and God's will, and this is the price we paid. The wilted flowers mean death. The jet brooch means mourning. The black crepe means a widow. The smile means something else entirely, something the photographer didn't intend, something that crept into the image like a ghost bleeding through from the spirit world that so many Victorians believed was separated from our own by only the thinnest of veils. The smile means I'm not sleeping. I'm not at peace. I'm smiling because I must, because someone has made me smile, but inside this smile is a scream, and inside this stillness is a struggle, and inside this death is something that will not die. Photographers' journals from the period sometimes contain passages that betray unease with their profession. One photographer in Boston wrote in 1883, I have photographed the dead now for 7 years, and in that time I have come to know them as well as I know the living, perhaps better, for they do not move or speak or protest. But lately I have begun to dread the work. The faces of the dead seem to follow me, appearing in my peripheral vision when I walk the streets at night. I hear them whispering in the hiss of the chemicals in my darkroom. I see them standing behind me when I catch my reflection in windows. They want something from me, I think. They want me to see them as they truly are, not as the living wish to remember them. They want me to look behind the pose, behind the arrangement, behind the lie of the smile. They want me to see the truth of death, and I am afraid that if I do, I will never be able to look away. The photographer who wrote those words was found dead in his studio 3 weeks later, apparently of heart failure. He was 32 years old, in good health, with no history of heart problems. His body was discovered slumped over his developing tank, his hands submerged in the silver nitrate bath, his face frozen in an expression that witnesses described as terror. The police ruled it a natural death, but the photographer's assistant quit the profession immediately after and never spoke of what he had seen in the studio that night. The photographer's journals and plates were sold at auction and scattered among various collectors. Some of them have surfaced over the years in museum exhibitions about Victorian mourning practices and post-mortem photography. None of them show anything unusual, just the ordinary images of death dressed as sleep, of corpses posed as if alive, of families gathered around their dead with expressions of solemn grief. But in one photograph taken in the last week of the photographer's life, there is something odd. The image shows a young woman in a black dress, seated in a parlor chair, her hands folded in her lap. She is smiling, a slight smile that doesn't reach her eyes. The photograph is dated April 1888. It is the photograph on your desk. You turn it over with trembling fingers, looking for any markings on the back, any notation that might explain where it came from, who sent it, what it means. The reverse of the print is blank except for a single line of text, written in a spidery hand with ink that has faded to brown. She is waiting for you to see. The temperature in the room has dropped. You can see your breath misting in the air. The lamp on your desk flickers once, twice, and then goes out, plunging the room into darkness. But you can still see the photograph. It seems to generate its own light, a faint phosphorescent glow that illuminates the woman's face, that terrible smile, those empty eyes that are looking at you, directly at you now, no longer focused on some distant point but on you here now. And you understand finally what the photograph is. Not a post-mortem portrait. Not a memorial. Not a document of Victorian mourning practices. It is a door. An opening. A space between the world of the living and the world of the dead, created by the alchemy of light and silver, held open by the violation of posing a corpse as if alive, of forcing the dead to smile, of denying death its dominion. The Victorians, in their grief and denial, in their determination to keep their loved ones present even after death, created something they didn't understand. A way for the dead to look back at the living, to reach across time, to find those who would look long enough and close enough to see the truth behind the posed smile and the propped open eyes. She is smiling because she wants you to know she is there. She has always been there, trapped in the silver of the print, suspended in the moment of exposure, neither alive nor truly dead but caught in the space between. And now that you have seen her, truly seen her, understood what you are looking at, she can see you too. The connection runs both ways. The door swings both directions. Your hand reaches out without your conscious volition and touches the photograph. The surface of the print is cold, colder than paper should be, cold like metal, like ice, like dead flesh. And at the moment your finger makes contact, you feel something else. A response. A pressure. As if someone is touching you from the other side, reaching through the paper, through time, through the barrier between the living and the dead. A cold hand on your hand. Fingers interlacing with yours, mimicking the pose of the woman in the photograph, hands folded, hands joined. The smell of chemicals is overwhelming now, ether and alcohol and silver nitrate and something else, something organic and putrid, the smell of flowers left too long in a vase, of crepe fabric that has absorbed the odor of embalming fluid, of hair cut from a corpse and woven into jewelry. You try to pull your hand away from the photograph but you cannot move. Your fingers are locked in that cold grip, held fast by something that is using the photograph as a bridge, a gateway, a thin place where the walls between worlds grow weak. And then you hear it. A sound like breath, like the exhalation from lungs that have not drawn air in more than a century. A whisper, words in a voice that is dry as paper, thin as wire. See me as I am. In the photograph, the woman's smile widens, the corners of her mouth pulling up further than any human mouth should go, revealing teeth, revealing the darkness of her throat, revealing the truth that has been waiting behind the pose all along. Her eyes, those huge dark eyes, reflect light that isn't there, and in that reflection you can see a room. Not your room, not the room you're in, but the photographer's studio from 1888, with its chemical-stained tables and its glass-plate cameras and its iron posing stands. You can see the photographer, young and pale, his hands shaking as he removes the cap from the lens. You can see the woman in the chair, her body stiff with rigor mortis, her skin gray beneath the rouge, her eyes propped open with glass prosthetics. You can see the wires in her cheeks, the dowel between her teeth, the iron stand behind her back. You can see the other figures in the room, shadowy figures that were never meant to be in the photograph but that bled through anyway, drawn by the act of capturing death on film, of forcing the dead to perform one last time for the living. And you can see the moment when something went wrong, when the photographer realized that he had captured more than an image, that he had opened something that should have remained closed, that in his studio filled with the corpses of his subjects and the ghosts of his own guilt, he had created a space where death could look back at life, where the dead could reach through the silver and the glass and the carefully constructed lies of Victorian mourning and touch the living world. The photograph was supposed to be destroyed. The photographer tried to burn it, but it would not burn. He tried to bury it, but it was returned to his studio. He tried to forget it, but it followed him, appearing in his darkroom on his workbench among his other plates. And finally, in desperation, he looked at it one last time, really looked at it, saw what you are seeing now, and in that moment of true seeing, the woman in the photograph reached through and stopped his heart. The photograph has been waiting since then, passing from hand to hand, from collector to collector, appearing in estate sales and antique shops, always finding its way to someone who will look at it long enough to understand, to see the 4 clues hidden in plain sight. The eyes that don't focus, the smile held by wire, the posture maintained by an iron stand, the symbols of mourning arranged around a corpse dressed as a living woman. Waiting for someone to complete the circuit, to bridge the gap between then and now, between death and life, between the woman who was forced to smile for the camera and the person who finally sees the truth behind that smile. Your desk lamp flickers back to life, and the sudden brightness breaks the spell. Your hand jerks away from the photograph and you stumble backward, nearly falling over your chair. The photograph lies on your desk, ordinary again, just an old albumen print, slightly faded, slightly foxed, showing a Victorian woman in mourning dress. She is smiling. The smile is slight, doesn't quite reach her eyes, but it's just a smile. Just an old photograph. Just a document of a dead woman from a dead time, nothing more. But you can still feel the cold pressure of those fingers interlaced with yours. You can still smell the chemicals, the flowers, the death. You can still taste silver on the back of your tongue. And when you look at the photograph now, you see what you cannot unsee. The wires, the stand, the wrongness of the smile, the emptiness of the eyes, the message encoded in symbols and shadows. She is waiting. She is always waiting. And now that you have seen her, truly seen her, she will wait for you. In old photographs glimpsed in antique shops, in portraits hanging in museums, in daguerreotypes displayed in books about Victorian mourning. In every posed smile, in every propped open eye, in every carefully arranged corpse dressed as life, she will be there, looking back at you, reminding you of the 4 clues that reveal the truth of death's smile. The unfocused eyes, the unnatural expression, the unnatural stillness, the symbols of mourning arranged around the lie. The Victorians believed that photographs captured a piece of the soul, that the camera could steal something essential from its subjects and trap it in silver. They were wrong about that, or perhaps they were more right than they knew. Perhaps what the camera captures is not the soul of the subject, but a space where souls can be trapped, suspended between exposure and development, between the moment the shutter opens and the moment the image appears in the chemical bath. Perhaps every photograph is a little death, a little opening, a door left slightly ajar. And perhaps some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. The photograph is still on your desk. You should destroy it, burn it, tear it to pieces, do what the photographer could not do. But you won't. You know you won't. Because now you need to understand more, need to find other photographs, need to see if there are more messages hidden in the archives of Victorian death photography, more clues, more truth. You need to know if she, the woman in the photograph, the woman who is waiting, is alone, or if there are others like her, trapped in silver and paper, reaching out across the years, touching the hands of anyone foolish enough or curious enough or unlucky enough to really look, to really see. You slide the photograph back into its manila envelope, but you know you will take it out again. Tonight, tomorrow, next week. You will study it again, will search for more clues, will trace the provenance of the print, will try to find the photographer's name, the woman's name, the story behind the image. You will become an expert in Victorian mourning photography, will learn to read the language of jet jewelry and wilted flowers and crepe veils. You will learn to see the wires and the stands and the glass eyes, to recognize death beneath the pose. And perhaps, eventually, you will take photographs of your own. Perhaps you will become one of them, the photographers who see too much, who understand too well, who learn the truth that the Victorians discovered and tried to hide. That death does not like to be denied, does not like to be dressed up and posed and made to smile for the living. That death has its own agency, its own will, its own patience. That death can wait in a photograph for more than a century, can reach through time and silver to touch the living, to remind us that the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we think, as thin as a layer of photographic emulsion, as thin as the moment between one heartbeat and the next. The smile in the photograph is not a lie. It is a promise. It says, "You have seen me. Now I can see you. Now I know you. Now I am waiting for you." And death is very, very patient. If you made it this far, you understand now why this knowledge needs to be shared, why the truth hidden in Victorian mourning portraits must be documented and preserved. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss our next investigation into the dark corners of photographic history. Comment below if you've ever encountered a photograph that made you feel the way this one does. That cold recognition, that sense of being seen from across an impossible distance. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what lurks behind the posed smiles of antique portraits. Because now you know, the dead are not sleeping. They are smiling. They are waiting. They are watching. And they are very glad you finally learned to see them. The photograph remains. The smile remains. And somewhere in the silver and shadow, she is still waiting,